Okay. Yes. Should we start? Ayman, are you ready? Okay, let's start. Hello everyone. Thank you for coming today. We know that there's around 40 site events going on today, so thank you so much for choosing this one and being with us here in this venue. I would like to introduce you to one of the most inspiring colleagues of our field, Mr. Ayman Manna from the Samir Kassir Foundation in Lebanon. And it's a big pleasure to be co-moderating this event, this quite special event today with you, Ayman.
Thank you, Laura. I want to return the compliment. Thank you very much for the friendship, the partnership, but also all the work you've done on media viability, on convening media development actors from different regions and really understanding what's happening on the ground.
Okay, so we're going to be guiding you through the session today. First of all, though, we would like to welcome you in the name of all co-hosts, which is quite an impressive number of co-hosts today. BBC Media Action is one of them, Deutsche Welle Akademie, the Center for International Media Assistance, CIMA, Columbia University, Anya's here, Samir Kassir Foundation, as we said, the Global Forum for Media Development. Where are our colleagues?
The chair is sitting right here.
Oh, sorry. I was looking for Tommy, who I saw earlier. And of course the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the US, who are also so kind to host us here. So thank you very much for that. We as co-hosts, but I think everyone here in the room, we have at least one thing in common, and this is that we care deeply for independent media and that we feel the urge to save quality journalism in these really quite difficult times. We know that there are a lot of big challenges, a lot of problems. We heard about the problems over and over again throughout the day yesterday. And I think quite too often we focus on these problems rather than looking at solutions and ideas. And there are these ideas. There are quite new and quite radical approaches to saving journalism. And this is what we want to focus on today. There's a quote that I like quite a lot, which we read out, which is, "The best way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas." So let's try and bring these ideas together here today. The aim is to go down a little bit different route to what everyone else is kind of used to normally. So this is an experiment today. We would like to have a conversation, a discussion with all of you in this big group. So we're not going to have long statements and long presentations of a few speakers, but you're all invited to contribute, and please take this seriously and contribute and be part of this discussion. It's a fishbowl format. Lots of people have asked me, what is a fishbowl? Is that a German thing? I've never heard about a fishbowl. No, it's not. We've done quite a lot of disciplines are actually doing this more and more, because there's a need and there's a demand for conversation and discussion rather than only always the same people speaking. So we've been doing it, but for this crowd, I think for our group today, it is an experiment, and there are quite a few rules that have to be followed for this to be successful. I'm going to explain the rules to you, but first of all, I'd like to ask Ayman to explain the structure a little bit and the themes that we'll discuss.
Yes, I'll focus more on the content, but the speakers are all of you. And when we mention radical approaches to saving journalism, let's just underline radical. And this is what we expect. There will be 3 sessions. Each session will last 30 minutes. First one has an interesting title. It's the system, stupid. And what we want to discuss altogether is this paradox. Can we find individual successful solutions, each organization on its own, each media organization, each media development group on its own? Can we find that one successful business model if the market itself is distorted in a way that is against independent media? Or is it about finding together an approach to systematically change the system, the market? So, or anything in between, and this is what we'll hear from you. The second session is entitled, Are Funds a Viable Solution? Funds, mainly we're talking about public funds, coming from one country, coming from multiple countries. So does it solve the problem of donor dependency? What are the challenges they bring in terms of perception, in terms of government agendas, changing government agendas? I mean, many people here around the room have lived through, for example, out of many other examples, the Syria experience. Drinking from the fire hose for a few years and then complete desert for the others, for the following years. So are they the solution? Are there other players who also have funds? Or we should actually think of radical solutions outside that scheme. And last but not least, market regulation for media viability. We're talking here about regulating the advertising market, many creative solutions, many attempts, bargaining codes, etc. But do we trust the regulators? Do we trust all the regulators or some regulators? And why and how to trust them? So these broadly would be some of the topics we're going to discuss together. And in terms of how we're going to discuss them, the format, back to you, Laura.
Exactly. So the rules of a fishbowl format. You can see that there's 4 chairs in the middle. The inner circle, that's the so-called fishbowl. And we're going to have 4 speakers, 4 people kind of starting the discussion for each of the 3 themes that Ayman just mentioned. And they're going to make very short initial statements, and whenever you feel that you're done, you've made your point, you don't have anything to add for the moment, you get up, you empty your chair so that someone else from the outer circle, and this also includes everyone in the back, can come in and join the discussion. So ideally, there's a constant movement in here for different people coming in the inner circle and making a point. Once you're out, that doesn't mean you're always out. If you feel like, oh, I have another question, I have another point to make, you can always come back in. But the most important thing is, first of all, don't talk for too long. And if someone feels, okay, this person has been talking for too long, please really come up, just stand here, and then the person who's talking is going to feel a bit like, okay, maybe someone else is going to speak, and then they can do that. So this is how it works. But it's an experiment. And I learned that experiments have to have a very clear beginning and a very clear end. So if you feel that you're ready for the experiment, I would like to start the experiment officially, and I would like to ask everyone to raise one hand who's ready for the experiment. Please raise the other hand. Both of them, Ayman. And then we clap all together on 3, okay? So 1, 2. Okay, we can do that better. Once more. Okay, again. 1, 2. Super. Experiment started. Karsten, please, it's your turn for the first statement.
Thank you. And a microphone. Yeah. For those who don't know me, my name is Karsten von Nahm. I'm the managing director of DW Academy. And for those who don't know the Academy, it's the what we like to call the Center for Training, Consultancy and Media Development of Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's international public service broadcaster. Before we start to talk about radical approaches and maybe solutions, let me start with a radical confession. I think we have failed. Not always, of course, not in every instant. I think all of us here, we do our best to try to prevent worse from happening. We support free media and freedom of speech, but we haven't found really the magic formula you were talking about for preserving independent quality media in the face of the digital revolution, the rise of big tech companies, the onslaught of authoritarian regimes, and even the anti-liberal instincts of democratically elected governments. There are a few things that we try. I mean, funds from international donors can help media to survive for a certain time. Training, consultancy, capacity building can help to professionalize management, raise journalistic standards, improve audience research, and maybe help also to find some new business models, or part of it by, I don't know, having a better connection with the community, improve advertisement and so on. But in the end, the breakdown of the traditional business models where you get income revenue from selling copies and selling advertisement, that really hasn't been replaced, and we're still looking for a solution for that. So my question here is what we do too little too late? And do we have to focus more on the big picture instead of supporting individual organizations and media companies? What can we do? How do we do it?
Thank you for co-moderating.
Carsten, I don't think that we failed entirely. Remember, it's the system, stupid. So we have, GFMD has attempted to support partners to start having this discussion about media viability, because unfortunately it's not happening everywhere. And I think that maybe we need to up the ante in terms of support for partners to have this discussion and come up with those radical approaches that are needed, but more specifically at, let's say, a national, potentially hyper-local level. So yes, GFMD has been supporting this in a number of countries. So let me give you the example of Namibia. So there's a very concerted, let's say, desire to start engaging with big tech. And it's been done in other countries and with mild success. But what I've learned from the Namibian experience is that as a country, Namibia, for example, is so inconsequential. If you consider its population of 2.5 million and a very small media sector. So what is the radical approach here? The radical approach, I think, would be, in Namibia, for example, to have a multi-stakeholder approach where it's not only media speaking to big tech, but a collective multi-stakeholder national approach of media, private sector, government, the regulators, everyone will have a real investment in supporting free and independent public service media. And then secondly, to do that at a regional, potentially SADC level, and even better if it could be upscaled to a regional African level. Yeah.
Thank you, good afternoon. My name is Eric De La Fuente. I'm a professor at Florida International University in Miami, Florida, and my area of research has been primarily on press freedom. In particular, in a book I wrote last year, I look at the early signs, at the early warning signs. And I always say, you know, why don't we go to the doctor when we're feeling healthy once a year? And you go to get these early signs. And usually when you get an early sign in your doctor and they say, oh, you got something wrong with your blood cell, you go and treat it because you don't want for the big illness too. I remember when Hugo Chavez won in 1998 and the early signs of taking out government advertising or pressuring a company. But it wasn't a big deal then. I wrote a piece in 2001 talking about it. It wasn't that. I remember when Viktor Orban was a darling in the European Union of the democracies. I think there's so many examples of all you guys know. We look, and they really try to fall into areas, right? The economic pressure that we all know here, whether it's government advertising or pressuring the private sector or capturing the media with pro-friendly business people as well, that tend to go under the radar early, in the early signs, when they still don't have full control of society. And the same thing goes with harassment, for example. You know, Facebook or Twitter can ban a certain celebrity or politician, but do they ban those people who threaten the life of a journalist? I mean, they need to be invited into this conversation, but not when they're telling them they're going to kill you. At the early signs, do we engage with that? And I think that we need to think along the ways. I mean, and the reason I bring Hungary is not because Orban now said, but it was even inside the European Union, right? For a long time, we've been dealing that Latin America is an area I worked on. And of course, I was born in Cuba. This is the worst of the dictatorships, right? So I mean, for sure, we need to handle that. And of course, if you look at Venezuela, backsliding, or Nicaragua. But for example, I did a lot of work in Argentina, right? This is a liberal democracy where there's exchange of powers, where the judiciary sometimes challenges, where the media is very active. but the level of pressure on the media, they just squeeze you slowly. By the time they squeeze you too hard, it's far. So what I plan to challenge is that yes, of course we should focus where a journalist is being imprisoned, or of course it's being beaten up. First, obviously we should do that. But we should really encourage, just like you do with a patient. If you can tackle a problem early, a lot of times the number of resources to resolve it is a lot less than when that illness becomes a cancer and when media. So that's my challenge or my conversation that I wanna place here today.
So, hi, I'm Cristina Zahar. I'm the Executive Director of the Brazilian Association of Investigative Journalism. And I was listening to Henrico. He speaks Portuguese. I think only both of us. Oh no, Natalie also speaks a little bit. Yes, you're right talking about the early signs. We had Bolsonaro for 4 years, so we got rid of him in the elections last year, but Bolsonarism is not gone. So there are still a lot of threats against journalists and a lot of attacks on the press in Brazil. But what I would like to talk about is about an initiative that Abrage is leading since 2018. It's called the Project Comprova. It's a coalition of 40 media outlets that work together to debunk disinformation. And how we managed to put them all together. Because disinformation is a disease, and it's when we have polarization, like in Brazil and in other countries, disinformation can kill you. Because during the pandemic, we did a lot of work within the coalition, and during these years, of the 1,045 contents, we had 370 about the pandemic, and most of them were false. Only 6 of these 1,000 that I mentioned were true. So this is a way of making competitive outlets to work together. So I think I will leave it there for us to think if we are able to do it in other areas of journalism.
How much solidarity is there when you bring those different organizations together? What can they really change? Or do you see success already in the initiative that you have there?
Yeah. Well, I forgot to say, but the initiative, of course, is funded by the platforms of Google and Meta. And we pay for the media outlets to have people dedicated to debunk disinformation as a team. So I think the model is successful because we have 2 journalists for different media outlets working together to debunk a certain disinformation. And they produce a piece, and there is peer review by 3 other media outlets. And everybody at the end of the process, if it is approved, they can all publish the same content, and we add all the logos together. So I think and they get funded for to put someone from the team to work in Comprova, or to hire someone to be dedicated to the project. So I think this is a model that is successful because it's around since 2018, and I hope Abrage can get more funds to get the project running for a long, long time.
But does it mean that then the media are making themselves even more dependent on the big tech companies, which are actually part of the problem because they're taking all the revenue from advertising? Yeah,
it's true, but it's a way of fighting disinformation and putting all the media together against, disinformation. So I think, well, if there is money there, you can get the money to do good stuff. It's a kind of way of saving journalism, I would say.
Yeah, just one thing, so I can move out of the fishbowl is. On some of these associations, one of the things we're trying to do is when you have a lot of things we don't think of where the private sector money, still advertising, by the way, for the most part, even in countries where the government is the #1 advertiser, comes from private sector. So if you have some international companies that are supporting media, let's say in 2 countries, you know, a lot of times the role is, let's introduce them in another country. And maybe they don't, but maybe they do, because a lot of time, especially that digital-only media, because the one thing, at least in Latin America, the leading online media outlets are former traditional media, right? Which are part of conglomerates, but it's very rare. And with the ones that are successful are usually backed by international companies. So getting other private companies to go and that are already funding some of the media to be introduced, even as a business leader, you want to call that, I think it's a good strategy. So, yes.
I have to jump in here, and I'll be here very short. But I see a conflict between this multi-stakeholder idea, which I think we haven't done enough, and us only following the agenda of the platforms by doing all kinds of fact-checking initiatives, all kinds of disinformation programs that sometimes are counterproductive, in my opinion. Sometimes they result in the opposite of what you want to achieve. And the journalists should get that together and act, you know, as political actors in a way to get the multi-stakeholder discussions going and to, you know, create a strong coalition to then get into a conversation with the platforms. That's my little 2 cents.
Very important point. You triggered, or you put your finger on the contradiction. So we hope that these seats will be filled with people who will, you know, continue on this. Yes, go for it. Quickly introduce yourself, please.
Hello everyone, I'm Caroline Vima with Fondation Hirondelle. The media we work with or we created are in very fragile context, so it is only one side of the picture we're discussing here today. But these are contexts with corruption, and I want to raise this because we try to either have public funding for media or have advertising for media or grants, and it doesn't go straight to the media, to the salary of the journalist, to the functioning of the media outlets because of corruption. And so is the system stupid? The overall world system is stupid because when there is money involved, then you have pressure, corruption, temptation. So I think we have to be also aware of this. Thank you.
Wow, that is vacuum here.
I was about to say, I'm now going to discuss this with myself.
So I'm not sure, are we allowed to, is it the right time to talk about systemic challenges?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, so I have 3...
And solutions.
And solutions, okay. So I have, but we need to understand the challenges to understand the solutions. Sorry, I'm Toby Mendel from the Centre for Law and Democracy in Canada. I see 3 systemic problems dominating. I purchase 3 newspapers in my home. I have 3 kids, and they don't purchase any newspapers. And it's not because they don't have enough money. They're happy to pay extra $400 for a phone with a better camera. They'll pay $7, $8 for a coffee anytime they need it. They don't think that media is worth buying. They buy the things that they value, and they don't think media is worth buying. So I think we need to change that. And I mean, I don't have an exact solution for that, but obviously media and information literacy that everybody's talking about is one of the solutions for that. Second problem, or second solution, more solution, I guess. I mean, you talked about public subsidies, and you talked about donor dependency. I think we need to distinguish between governments treating media as a public good like they treat roads and healthcare and education as a public good, and every government in the world pays for those things, not by I mean, yes, the donors may help and support or whatever, but they pay it themselves, every country, and yet, you know, my country, Canada, even though we have a reasonably progressive outlook on those kind of things, but we actually have declining amount of public money going into support for our own media. So I think that we need to really address that. And the third thing I would point to, I mean, you know, we rely on markets for the media. I mean, the 2 main sources of revenue that you mentioned, advertising and subscriptions, are market-driven modalities. markets need to be regulated when they get out of sync. Capitalism doesn't work at all if we don't regulate markets when they start to get dysfunctional. Our markets right now are hugely dysfunctional. We have dominant market players that we're not regulating. And I mean, we all know who they are, of course. And I mean, we're not even regulating them to the point where national governments are capturing the taxes that they're owed from these companies. We're not even doing that, let alone in redressing the imbalance between these, the big tech and the media companies. So I think that we need to do that. And I mean, the solution there is for governments to regulate. My own government is doing something in that space, and I know Australia, the Australian approach was quite criticized. So it was the first or an early one, and we learn as we go on, and we'll get better at it. And I think that that has to be an important part of the solution.
Thanks, Simon. I'm Tom. I work for the Global Forum for Media Development. So my contribution is that many of our smaller members, they are able to sustain their journalism by doing other things, such as training. Donors love funding training. They don't want to pay for their journalism, but they will fund them to train others. So often we have a scenario where a large part of their income is to do media development work, training and other things, but as a means to have the funds to support their journalism. But many people wouldn't see that as being sustainable or think that's viable because that's money from a donor, therefore you're not being viable. But they've been going for 10, 20 years using that model of a hybrid approach of some advertising, some services, delivering media development programs as a means to stay functioning as a publisher. But most people, there's a kind of trend that, no, that's not viable. You're not viable because it's not a purely private, market approach. But they've been going 10, 20 years, and they're going to continue with that model because that's what they can access. So is that a model that we will accept as being sustainable, or is that not good enough because it's not purely based on membership subscriptions, advertising, etc.? That's my question. And if so, then maybe we should be, rethinking how we imagine how donor support supports independent journalism. Even though that's not an ideal way that it happens, in reality, that is how many organizations fund their journalism.
Tom, is this on? Yeah. I feel optimistic. Oh, sorry, Anya Schifrin, Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. And we have a good contingent here, Dylan Groves from our PhD department, Audrey Hatfield, also from SIPA. I feel like donors are getting more realistic, actually, and that we're here, that more and more donors understand nobody's going to survive in a low-income country just on selling subscriptions, and the advertising, has never been really much of an option. So I feel like there's more realism among donors now about that. I don't know if you've seen a shift.
There are some shifts, but the majority of funding that's available for our smaller members is not to support their journalism, as in, we'll give you this funding so you can produce journalism.
Sure.
It's always to achieve another, either it's a development goal, or it's to deliver training, or services, a part of a kind of wider program.
Yeah, well, definitely the earmarking for particular content. By the way, just as an aside, when my husband was at the World Bank 20 years ago, this was the fight with the IMF about Ethiopia's budget. Could foreign aid be counted as a sort of regular, source of revenue? My husband's view is absolutely, because as you say, people can get aid for decades. So I think that I agree with that. Yeah.
So far, we're all basically looking at ways to integrate the system or take advantage of the system and make the most out of the system. Haven't heard people who want to destroy it all and build something new.
I just want to ask Toby something. Or make a comment to something that you said, Toby. Can you just elaborate a little more on regulation, and ideally good regulation? Because in my part of the world, regulation in most cases means control.
Yeah.
And that is not what we
And this
want.
is actually a teaser for the last session.
All right, well.
Could I add to your question real quick? Okay, this is working great. Dylan Groves from Columbia University. I want to add to this question. So I spent the last 2 years doing research with local media organizations in Tanzania. And so when you talked about, government supporting and government regulating, my ears perked up because that all sounded like bad language among the journalists and media owners that I'm talking from. So I'm wondering what your kind of proposals would be in a situation in which you can't necessarily trust the good judgment of the government to support the type of independent journalism you'd like to advocate for.
So, maybe Anya should come back up here. I know a lot about media regulation and not a lot about financial regulation, so I'm not putting myself put the wrong airs on here. I think structural regulation of markets is less threatening than the direct regulation or regulatory instruments that you're talking about. So, putting in place rules. Of course, you do need, the media may not have the leverage to do that, and so maybe we need, transnational or global regulation or something. It's much more complicated to do these things than our normal market mechanisms, because these companies are not only, very, very international, but they can operate in your country and make money and whatever in your country without even touching you, which hasn't traditionally been the case. So I don't know how that kind of regulation might work. I'm very, very conscious of this issue that repressive state, asking repressive states to fund or certainly regulate, but even fund, as a public good. It's one thing for Tanzania to build roads, which it does, and there's some corruption, there's some bias, there's some political influence in there, as there is everywhere. I live in a small province of Canada, and our roads are very politically driven, actually, but that's not quite as toxic or threatening as direct regulation of the media. There are ways to try to reduce that. They're not foolproof, certainly, but you can build regulatory systems that that have bulwarks against political interference, which cannot prevent really determined political interference, but can prevent it off a bit. And I guess, in any particular context, you need to weigh out, how bad is that risk versus not having any funding from the national government. It's always a balancing exercise, and nothing is perfect.
Absolutely. If I could just add one more comment is, I couldn't agree more. Finding a balance between the support you would get from government as well as the biases that might introduce seems like the name of the game. But I also I think I come with a little bit of a message of hope. So I spent the last 2 years working with local media organizations, supporting with the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, supporting investigative journalism. And part of what I found is that, a demonstrated effect of local journalism can do a wonderful job of helping build those kind of coalition, multi-stakeholder coalitions, not just in the international community, but also the local community. So when you start seeing quality local reporting that resonates with communities, business owners, etc., they're starting to kind of build its own momentum of sponsorships by local businesses. So this is very much at a local level, which means lower costs and easier to get involved. But it kind of raised a sense of hope in me that these kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives could also resonate at a local level.
Just one comment to that, and then please.
A brief one.
And then I'm going to leave. But I think the risk of political interference diminishes as you have more multiple tools of funding. So the idea that public funding would be everything, that is very threatening. But if it was just one of several components, less so.
Okay, last comment on the systemic approaches, and then we're going to go to a new focus.
Good.
Nick.
Yeah, I wanted to agree with Zoe and Dylan, and but multi-stakeholderism is a fairly dull word, but collective action maybe sounds a little more exciting and a little more radical. But look, there's no silver bullet, there's no blueprint. I think everything is going to be contextual, but the one thing that I think you can do in context after context is communicate that journalists can't save journalism alone. And there's a bit of reluctance sometimes in the journalistic community to form alliances and to think of themselves as an actor within the political system defending their own interests collectively with others. The reflex is we got to write better stories. We got to be better journalists, write better stories. Eventually they're going to come around. And I think when you see the examples of Ukraine, when journalists are under extreme pressure, and in Burma, you see the reflex instead to that Lebanon, forming these collective alliances that put that puts media sector in a broader context of political and democratic reforms. Look at everything that's been achieved in Ukraine since 2014, and it is an extreme example under such tremendous pressure. But going back to what Eric was saying, I think the radical approach is to not wait and be reactive, to build those collective networks when journalism is facing an existential crisis, but for all of us together to think about how we can build those networks of collective action affirmatively and proactively. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we've already, I think, lots of points came up, lots of different kind of aspects came up, but Ayman, I would like to ask you, what's your main takeaway of this first 30 minutes?
In every session, I'll give one main takeaway and something new that I learned. So one main takeaway is that we're kind of reasonable, realpolitik-driven people. And maybe the conversation would have been different if we held it at the university campus somewhere, but I'm happy with that. The new thing that I'd like to highlight is this focus on hyperlocal. Hyperlocal, multi-stakeholder solution, and the idea of trusting the locals in terms of knowing their market, knowing the challenges, and knowing what to say to rebuild trust with their communities. And trust is a missing factor in the crisis. So by putting the hyperlocals in the driver's seat, they can leverage their communities and potentially achieve more change. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to have we're going to turn to our second theme, which is about funds, about international funds, about state funds, about hybrid funded funds. And I would like to ask our 4 fund speakers, please, into this inner circle.
Hi everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Maha Taki. I work for BBC Media Action, a media development advisor. So I'm just going to be doing a bit of a setting the scene, and then I'll pass on to the fund. We're all here today because we recognize there's a business model crisis in our world. This looks different in many parts of the world, and in the global north, this is because, as we all know, advertising has moved to platforms. Now in the global south, we've had a sustainability crisis for much longer and for very different reasons. Both of these have similar impact in terms of the information flow and the quality of information. So in the last session we talked about, is it the system stupid? And I'd like to also ask, is it international development assistance stupid? I mean, we're not going to make systemic changes if the architecture of international development assistance doesn't change. It's always pegged, as I think somebody mentioned, to particular themes, but it's also 2 to 3 year budgets. So you're not going to change the system with 2 to 3 year budgets. You need sustainable injections and stable injections of money. And this is what these funds are meant to be doing, supplying sustainable and stable injections of money. But they're doing it differently. There's an international fund, a national fund, and a different kind of fund. They use different methodologies and have various resources. Now I just want to ask, what do they solve? Are these funds effective in terms of saving journalism? Do they solve the challenges inherent in other forms of funding, such as the legitimacy issue? Who gets to choose who is being rewarded and based on which criteria? So I'd like everybody to answer that if you can. Also, national funds are notorious for being captured by government and for being rewarded or allocated unfairly. So we've done a lot of learning from other funds. What have we learned and what are we doing differently with the national fund? So I'll stop there and pass it on to Khadija, who'll talk about the international fund.
Thanks very much, Mahana. I'm Khadija Patel with the International Fund for Public Interest Media. And I'm from South Africa. You might have heard me talk about it a bit this week. And in South Africa, we're a middle-income country, so certainly have different economic realities than some of the contexts that, for example, Caroline's organization works in Africa and even in Namibia. So, we are middle income. But For the last 10 to 15 years, news media have been in free fall, and for various reasons, political capture, but also our economy has not been at its best. It's still in a dire condition, and the result of that is news media is slowly eroding. And I think that what I want to emphasize is that when we talk about media extinction, it's not an on and off button. It is a slow process, a slow hollowing out of news media organizations that takes time. Sometimes news media organizations can cling on for years, but the efficacy of those media organizations is slowly burnt out. We're seeing it happening in South Africa, and it's because of my experience there as a journalist, as a newsroom leader, that I really believe that we need something radical. We need to actually think about this in a transformative way. This is no longer a problem of a business model. This is a societal failure to fund a public good. That is what is at stake. And so the International Fund for Public Interest Media is such an initiative that aims to be ambitious enough to address this. We don't intend to be around forever, but instead hope to raise enough funding in the next 10 years to first of all ensure that there are healthy media ecosystems in low and middle income countries, but also match that up with the knowledge capital to ensure that these ecosystems survive beyond us.
Hi, I'm Abira Watt. You're a bit shortchanged because you should have had Dr. Soa from the very newly established National Fund for Public Interest Media in Sierra Leone, and one of the very first grantees of the International Fund. And I'm going to use that as a case study rather than talking more generally, because that's when we can start really to dissect the issues. About a year and a half ago, I was with BBC Media Action at the time. We were approached by the Ministry for Communications and Media in Sierra Leone to say, we would like you to help us set up a means and a call for investors to come and invest in the Sierra Leone media. And I come from a commercial background, so I thought, who on earth in their right mind will invest in the media of Sierra Leone on a commercial basis, because it's such a poor country. There's no advertising, and it just doesn't stack up. So fortunately, they did accept that they need to look at a much wider solution and understand what exists in the market and how you can harness several sources of income. But simultaneously, and that leads me back to the first session earlier on, is how do you combine that with the systemic changes that are needed in order for that money that will come very hard from both government budget and international donors, how that money will actually be effective in changing the access that citizens have to media. Cut a long story short, a year ago at World Press Freedom Day, after a national action plan made up of 7 points, which included reform in the legal system, a call on the media itself to merge, to form alliances, to shrink its impossible size down, to referring to your point about market regulation. And the government then made a pledge to provide 3% of its national budget, and IFPIM had agreed to match that investment to form the National Action Plan, the National Fund for Public Interest Media. That was a year ago. I'm glad to report that now a framework had been written, the grant had been agreed, and I was trying to talk to the minister the other day to get him to actually pay the check-in into the account rather than just telling us. That is the key part. I keep being told it's committed, but until you see the money in an account, and the account was set up already. So very briefly, the challenges are that very complicated document that need to be put together in order to manage that fund, in order to ensure that it is a combination of local stakeholders that come from all parts of the Sierra Leone sector, and to ensure that there's a fair and transparent way of awarding, and a way in which that money will actually go, will not, how shall I put it? If there's a new opportunity of funding because a new fund had been created, there'll be now at least 50 media organizations newly established trying to draw in on that. So how do we manage to define the remit of that fund in a way that will ensure that only a small amount of organizations who are genuinely serving the public interest? I'll stop there.
You're also meant to have somebody else in this seat. My name is Meredith Malagny with Media Development Investment Fund, and our CEO, Harlan Mandel, was supposed to be sitting here as well, but I'm very happy to be here. And MDIF kind of takes a different approach. I mean, for us, we are what I consider kind of a combination of a human rights organization and an impact investment fund. So in the countries where we work, we actually don't have any good experience with government. It's quite the opposite. It's usually, we're working in countries because there is a lot of government corruption, there's, you know, corruption at all levels, and keeping the independent media free and separate from that is what our goal is. So our kind of theory of change and ethos is, if you're able to be financially independent, then you're able to be editorially independent, and then you're able to actually have effect and change on society. So we do that in a variety of ways through a variety of different funds that are separate from government funding. Our funds are set up to kind of address the different needs of different markets. So we're working all over the world. What works in one country might not work in another country. The needs of the independent media might be able to accept a loan from us in some countries where the media is a little bit more advanced. In other countries where they're new, getting kind of just off the ground, a little bit more sustainable, but you know, not ready to accept a loan, they'd work with us for an equity investment. And we have different vehicles and different funds to serve these different purposes. One of the newest funds that we've just recently launched is our blended capital fund, Pluralis. So that is very exciting for us because it really is bringing in private capital. So private capital meaning very well-established media houses, high net worth individuals, philanthropy, and even a ethical bank has come in and issued an impact bond. So now this is being offered to retail clients. So actually people are now, you know, regular everyday people are having the opportunity to make an investment in independent media. This fund was launched specifically for Europe, in Central Europe, I should say, because of the changes that we've seen most recently with a lot of government corruption and media capture. So this came out of that need, and it really addressed the market with making sure that large, well, a variety, but to start, 2 large media houses in 2 different countries were protected and did not have you know, media capture in one case and retaining the independence of the other media house.
So I just want to say something before I go away, and it's actually a response to the first session, and it's also a response to a question we often receive at the International Fund about donor dependency and aren't you creating a culture of donor dependency. So I just want to dial that back a little bit. If we all acknowledge that we face a grave crisis in which human beings like you and I do not have access to independent information that allows them to make decisions about their life, and the only way they can get that information is through donor-funded media, I think that's okay, right? Should that be there forever? I would think that we can develop as a human species to ensure that all human beings have access to information in a sustainable way, that flow, that supply of information is secured. But right now, in a moment of grave crisis, I think we have to stomach the fact that some organizations are going to be dependent on donor financing to ensure human beings like you and I get their information.
Great, thanks. Heather Gilbert, Center for International Media Assistance. I have a question for the speakers, similar to some of the comments that have been made. So we've talked a lot about funds kind of collecting money in innovative ways, but what about how you deploy capital in innovative ways? How are you thinking about that? Are there pathways to sustainability? I know Pluralis, obviously you have comments on this, but I guess if we're giving aid in the same old ways, but just collecting it in a new way, is that actually going to transform the media to become more sustainable?
Well, I would say, I mean, and to Khadijah's point, I think one of the nice things is there are organizations and funds that are set up, you know, to address lots of different needs. So, you know, it is true, donor needs are very important, and I think that's great then that there is a mechanism in a way for those types of media organizations to access that money, because it is true, depending on what country you're in, the funding that you receive and that you need is going to be different. It's going to make a difference what a success is in one country versus another. So yes, I think, you know, it's also an interesting point about we're collecting funds differently, how are we deploying it? And I think, you know, from NDIF's perspective anyway, we're deploying it, for us it's a long-term kind of relationships. We're deploying it with the intent to help build capacity, build sustainability, build technical assistance. We have various, you know, programs to kind of address and help nurture media organizations as they evolve, but it is very true. I think depending on where you are based, the needs that you have and what's, you know, reasonable and sustainable are going to be different.
There are funds available for information manipulation, and big funds as well. And they're also, joining this marketplace. So in our thinking about funds, we're specifically talking about the ones that support independent public service media, because no need to put the list. When we talk about these funds, are we also thinking about the competition and how to address the competition coming from less benevolent players? Would anyone would like to join the fishbowl and answer this?
I'll just say very quickly, in most parts of Africa right now, there's huge foreign government investment in media. And I don't want to name check the particular governments, but they have less than democratic ambitions, shall I say. And they are both buying up equity or supplying content. And this is happening right throughout.
And hardware as well.
Yes, sometimes hardware as well. Hardware supplied with spyware. Yeah, so, and in what I, you know, when I'm sitting here in New York, what I'm trying to explain to you people that things are so bad in some contexts, right? When you have a newspaper to put together in Nigeria, and it's a place that is already challenged with professionalization issues, where brown paper envelope journalism is still the norm, and you're struggling to fill a newspaper, and a particular government agency is offering you free content that you can add any byline you want to it. It's becoming a no-brainer for many, many publishers. And that is what independent media is up against.
I'm Nancy Krager-Camel. I'm with the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents. I'm the chairman of the board. Fascinating conversation. What concerns me, though, is something that it permeates all of the information we've been given, and that's that there seem to be many valuable concepts and people at the table, but is there not a lot of redundancy, and can that redundancy be in some way eliminated by some form of continuity or society society of all of the very well-intended ideas. Thank you.
I'll just fill in a quick gap here. That connects us also with an earlier comment from somebody about finding the solutions across the board. I think part of the issue that you're raising goes back to the basic idea that we really need to differentiate not just between countries but between experiences, and I think that we have been encouraged to find the multiplier effect on every area we work in. So we would like you to now do this in this country and use the same approach again. And I think that's partly why we are multiplying on the media development side. We have to recognize that we cannot save, nor do we want to save, every media organization in every country. I will say it again, we need to stop the tendency for media and civil society that works with media development in country to develop simply because it's a really nice source of income. And we need to understand that we need to take these different approaches in particular countries. I mean, my colleague from MDIF, who just moved out, and one of the projects that we've been working with MDIF, the reason why we supported what we did in Sierra Leone is because the MDIF approach wouldn't have worked. So I'll leave it at that, I think.
If I may, just answer, I don't think we can develop a UNESCO for media development in the sense that we find a one-fits-all solution. I'm quite happy that there's some competition between the approach MDIF just presented and the IFPIM approach. I mean, MDIF just clearly stated they want to, stay away from the danger of corruption and work independently with the media. And with IFPIM, I'm not so sure what the approach is. Maybe they will have to test it. And I think we're here in a professional environment, and for me, professionality is always about collaboration and about competition, right? It's always both, and it's the mix. And this will drive us forward. The competition we have as media development organizations, as funders, to see what works best, but we need to be in exchange to really learn from each other to improve things. But I don't think we will find a one-fits-all solution.
I was not really suggesting one size fit all. I'm just saying that there is a great deal of excellent ideas, wonderful groups working on it. Every country has its own unique situation, problems, and issues. I'm just saying that there are many funds out there that are viable contributors, and if there is a way that we could make an amalgamation or a coalition, as opposed to having redundancy, whether it's in an individual country or internationally, and not depend on the sponsors. I will also say that we are very much sponsor-driven at our organization, but we have a Chinese wall. The sponsor has absolutely no intake or opportunity to influence the journalists in our group.
Yeah, so we do need the standards as well, so I couldn't agree more. Yeah, thanks.
I don't want to fall into the trap to co-moderate, but I'm just watching this. The question that is in my mind is really, so how do we bring this all together? I mean, I completely agree with Khadija that we have where is she? Behind me. That we have this major problem, and there are other actors like, I don't know, the Chinese, the Russians coming in, giving media in need money for less benevolent purposes or goals. So yes, it's absolutely important that we do something. It's better to keep some of these public interest media alive to give people access to information. But on the other hand, of course, that means interfering with a dysfunctional market. It means you pick winners and losers, and it's not coming from the inside, it's coming from the outside. So the question really is, this can be part of the solution, but it has to be kind of a package. As we said, capacity building is part of it, making media organization fitter, but also maybe changing regulation to a point. I would like to drag Zoe in again, because when, for you coming from Namibia, and there are all these international donors and funds, trying to improve the situation, how is that seen in these countries locally? Is that support, or is that in the long run also maybe a damage? And how can we do this thing that you mentioned, that we kind of get a regional approach towards it, that there is an agreement among societies what should be done to save media as a value for people?
Carsten, first.
It works.
Yeah. Carsten, firstly, there isn't much funding coming into Namibia, to be quite honest. Donors or funders are moving out of the country for many, many reasons. A really good response to this crisis in Namibia would be to look at the track record of media. This is a very particular country with a very particular context, and that context needs to be understood, and a decision made based on that context, because there is no value in saving all media. Some have to go, some are not worth saving. So you would want to save, and even, if necessary, create new vehicles if there is a gap in the market. So I would propose that a real engagement with national players, understanding the context, and engaging them to be part of that solution from day one is very, very important. Now, I know it's not easy to get editors around the table. It's been very, very difficult for us to get them to start the discussion on media viability, discussion that benefits them in the first place. But I think this idea that journalists cannot save, journalists alone cannot save the media is now really, really, it's been better understood. And that's why I was proposing a multi-stakeholder approach. And Namibia, and I'm making this appeal because, for example, it's not only Namibia but other countries in the region where recently, there's discovery of oil and green hydrogen. So at this particular point, if the media isn't supported to play that watchdog role, if the media isn't strengthened, things can go really, really badly wrong.
We have 2 more interventions.
Cool. And I think already in Mozambique is an example of that already going very wrong. So the north of Mozambique, which has very rich gas deposits, part of that part of the country are completely inaccessible to any media, local or international. There is some kind of war going on there, perhaps Islamic State affiliates, perhaps Al-Shabaab, no one quite knows, and the Wagner Group is there. There's a whole host of deplorables and not a semblance of independent information coming out of that. So I think that Angola similarly. So I think that there's already, I think Mozambique is, for many reasons, Southern Africa as well, about what we have to guard against. I wanted to say to you, just respond to Carsten a little bit. I don't think that it's up to us to choose winners and losers. Ultimately, it will be audiences who will choose winners and losers. The problem that we have, I think, is twofold. The problem that we want to address, it is the supply. We want to ensure that more journalism is produced, but we also want to ensure that more journalism is received, is consumed. And I think ultimately, what we have to ensure, even as donors, is to go where audiences are, to support the audience behavior of news media, of news, rather than trying to impose our own understanding of what people need. And this is why I don't think that we can make decisions from the outside. Any intervention has to come with very regional, very hyperlocal driven knowledge. And I think I'll stop there for now.
I'll be very brief. I can still get to some. A quick challenge about how radical some of GFMD's members in the room are happy to be. And the reason I'm asking that question is because in some cases, donors are giving money to support media for Stratcom, for counter-narratives, for countering propaganda, and often we think, okay, we can take this money, we can filter it through our professional standards, and we can report back that we did what you wanted, but then we're not undermining the independence of the journalists and the media that we're working with. My question is, as a sector, would we consider being radical enough to actually push back when a call comes out which doesn't fit the standards that we would want, and we can see it's going to have a negative effect on how audiences perceive media in the long run, because they can see that it's getting involved in counter-narratives, communications, and dragging journalists into that? Would we be as radical to say, no, we're not taking that money, and we're going to make a public stand about it collectively until you change the framing of what you are expecting from the media support community? Would we be radical enough to say no to that money? Would we trust each other, not that someone else isn't going to go and get that money? And the other problem is that so many for-profit agencies who are not members of GFMD and don't have the same ethical professional standards and the same public service interest idea of media that we do would happily take that money, and they do. But so how radical are we going to be in pushing back against proposals or calls for proposals or grants which are basically Stratcom in disguise, and we take the money and we hope that we're not going to do too much damage in the process? Are we willing to be radical and actually collectively push back? We can't ask the question now, we're out of time, but there we go.
Very good question, though. We should have. Thank you so much for this. We're going to go to our last theme, but first I would like to ask Ayman, what's your main takeaway?
Again, the main takeaway is a very good connector with the first session. We mentioned context so much. The idea of truly understanding the context and linking the intervention to the context and adapting the form of investment of the fund to specific context is what will make it work, in order to avoid what Tom warned against, which I received from one of the largest donors, responding to our rejection of a fund because we thought it didn't work or wasn't adapted to context, and I quoted very quickly. We understand your concern for impact, but pragmatically for us in writing, and for other international donors and organizations, it's as much about impact as it is about reinforcing the perception that we are working on tackling these issues. So the idea that I think we can all work on is to make sure that we never receive such messages anymore.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's quite worrying. We should discuss the question that Tom raised. Maybe we get the chance to do that in this session. I mean, this is an experiment, as I said. We can be flexible as well, but I would like to ask the four last speakers on the regulation for media viability, on bargaining codes, and on the advertising market, and let's see whether we can come back to that point.
First I wanted to thank Thanos from the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents, who's been so generous in organizing this event with all of us and finding the space. As the New Yorkers, Thanos in Washington, but anyway, sort of on the ground logistics. I just want to acknowledge that. So Anya Schifrin, Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Many of you have helped over the last few years as we've been writing these reports called Saving Journalism, where we've mapped the world to see what solutions people have. I'll just make a couple of points quickly. One is, I think that there is a sense of urgency globally, and that the fact that we're all here talking about systemic is totally different than 10 years ago, when the idea was we would support the little global muckrakers, we'd have all these great local digital outlets, and everything would be wonderful, and Google just said, more and more startups. I think there's a realization we need bigger solutions, and that it's a hands-on deck. I agree with Nick's point. I think one thing that's really important is the connective tissue and the knowledge sharing that has to happen. And I think another point also made is, I'm married to an economist. There are trade-offs. There is not one single solution out there that is going, that's going to solve all our problems. Absolutely not. Clearly, when I look around the world, I'm going to talk about two regulations today, but obviously around the world, there's Canada, there's Northern Europe, where they're just doing millions and millions of wonderful things, you know, vouchers, tax credits, support for public broadcasters. Those are like the perfect. Then, you know, ideas, and then you have all these places like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America where it says, no, I don't want any government involvement at all. I would rather, you know, I'll take money from Gates, Soros, I'll take money from the US government, but I don't even want my own government to say you can get a tax credit because I just don't trust them. So it's like the gamut. And then the US, of course, has become a total outlier, which is why I asked Jose to come today. We're doing, one of the things that's happening in the US now is we're looking at something that was pretty much discredited everywhere else in the world, which is local advertising to support local news. We are actually in New York City, thanks to Jose and Mayor de Blasio's executive order. We've had government advertising in New York. I think you'll tell more about it, but a certain 50% has to go to outlets owned by migrant communities and communities of color. So, we, you know, 2010, my students and I told the government of Bhutan, do not do this, and they stopped. Here in New York, this is what we're doing, and we're looking at stuff like this, you know, Chicago, California. So that's one intervention that we're going to be hearing about today. And then a bigger one, of course, is the controversial bargaining codes. I've come out early on, 3 years ago, as a big supporter of the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. Burchu from Minderoo in the room is now, you know, funding a lot of efforts on taking it globally. We'll be hearing from Indonesia, which has been taught. We hope you're going to tell us what's happening with your bargaining code, and we hope you're not using it as an excuse to start doing all these fake news laws and quality control and all the bad stuff. But Brazil was supposed to vote yesterday on their version, again wrapped into a huge bill. Not sure if you all saw the Financial Times coverage, which was talk about cognitive capture, basically said this bill is bad for big tech, you know, it's terrible. Reuters coverage I thought was a lot better. But Google, I think, has succeeded in again killing the bargaining code in Brazil for the second time. Two interesting points. One is their tactics were so underhanded, they're now being investigated by the Brazilian government. And the second thing is what we've seen in Brazil, and I was just having an interesting conversation with Khadija about South Africa, is the splitting of the class. So around the world, what Google is doing, right, is they're going to the digital outlets and saying, you don't want to support this bill because all the money is going to the big guys. Let us create a separate fund just with you. So I think this is an interesting tactic. I'm not sure it's so terrible. In fact, if they come up with money, that's one way of doing it. But I did want to highlight that, and we're looking forward to hearing from our colleagues from Indonesia and New York City.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Helena. I work for BBC Media X and colleagues of Maha here. So interesting what Anya just saying, like the conversations about bargaining code in Indonesia starting 3 years ago after Professor Ken Cross released the report. And the Indonesian government trying to looking for a model that how actually they can improve the quality of journalism in Indonesia. And they work together with press consular Buninik here and to see what is the best framework model that can beneficial the media. And just to give a little bit of context here, Indonesia is the fourth largest population, so we have about 276 million people, and now striving and upcoming to be, I think, the fourth largest economic potentially in 2050. And that part will be digital economy. The government in Indonesia talk a lot about digital economy now. And also looking at the social media users is also one of the biggest. At least 60% of the population of Indonesia have a social media account. And Google, Facebook, Meta, Facebook, and also TikTok, they take 60% of the revenue in Indonesia, and that's actually killing the media viability in Indonesia. And I think starting a year ago, I remember that Mahawi brought the Indonesian government Kominfo, Ministry of Communications and Informatics, going to London to look for a model, what sort of format and frameworks that regulations can be implementing. So we spoke with a couple of people, including Ofcom, and also there was 2 ways actually. We were joking at the conversations. Oh, should we take the China road, which is completely ban the platforms, which is I think as a democratic countries, that's not the options that Indonesians will go with. But also another options that maybe at the same time we heard that the Australian already passed this new bargaining code law. So they, we then, been connected by Bursu to spoke with Australia, and that's the road that we are taking. Now, just answering what Tom just mentioned about donors. This is a big question. There's a challenging in designing phase for the donors. Like for now, we know that. I mean, it probably can explain and explore more. Google has become one of the biggest donors for the media, either it's big or small in Indonesia. And they've been operating a lot. They support the media. I also know that, I think they're at least giving about $250 for the journalists to work on the news in Indonesia. And that has become a challenge, how this bargaining code, one is passed. It's going to be a presidential decree. I think there's a lot of meeting has been going on, and Ibu is the main key persons here that that been discussed a lot, with the Google, also the Meta, TikTok in Indonesia. But the question is, if Google already support the media in Indonesia, big and small, even the small media in the countries, how this bargaining code is going to work, whether it will be effective in a way. Because I think that's the way how also, those platforms trying to stop this bargaining code being passed as a regulation. And the second issue, it's also this conversation about bargaining code is not really something that being aware a lot by media. Indonesia is a really big country. We have at least 42,000 media outlets in Indonesia, and it's like 1,400 islands, and some of the islands are pretty remote. So probably conversations about bargaining codes are not something that many media are aware of. So to what extent this will be also beneficial for those small media? Now the questions about the donor, who's the donor is here. So I think I pass to Ibu Ninik here from the Press Council to explain more about the bargaining code position in the Indonesian government. Please, Ibu.
Okay. Thank you. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Nini Rahayu, Chair of Press Council of the Republic Indonesia, and also I want to is my colleague, Pak Asep. Like Helena said, for the last 3 years, Press Council brought the discussion of developing a form of framework to be able to regulate the role of digital technology company to support media in Indonesia. Together with government, our constituent have been looking for a regulation model that fits and can resolve the media challenging in sustain the role of journalism. The Ministry of Communication and Information with Press Council discussing of regulation. We learn from the other models, Australia, UK, EU, and also a recent model from Canada. Our discussion and negotiation to fulfill the requirement consists of aspects which are first, sharing advertising revenue. Second, how the platform support the practice of good journalism. Therefore, there is an important note from the Press Council and the government. The last discussion on 10 and 27 April 2023. We finally a discussion first. I think about the regulation, there is no need to form a new institution outside the Press Council. Second, there shall be a new executive unit formed under the Press Council authority consisting of the Press Council, expert, and government. Third, the executive unit duties include bridging communication between press companies and digital platforms to negotiate, except for press company that can negotiate directly with digital platform company. So when platform and media dispute, then they came to the unit. The executive unit duties include ensuring digital platform company meet their responsibility to support media sustainability, ensuring the result of content distribution meet justice for press company, and conducting mediation and or other dispute resolution between press company and digital platform if negotiation are not reached, can go to pengadilan, to the court. Moreover, there are challenges to meet demand of media communications in Indonesia to achieve the level of playing field, especially to establish the regulation to be able to cover small media in Indonesia. And we also have to make sure that all verified media in Indonesia gain benefit from the code. Looking at the important role of journalism, government has pushed this forward to become a presidential decree, which we hope to be signed by President soon. Thank you.
Ibu, thank you for that. I think many of us have been looking for the English translation of the law, so I hope you'll be able to share this with us later. Is it a public copy? I guess, Ibu, will you be able to share a copy in English with us? Because that was very helpful. Okay. Thank you. Great. Thank you. Yeah, so I guess I'll just make a couple points before we move on to Jose. I mean, it's interesting because this is not using the competition authorities the way Australia did. So a presidential decree, maybe a faster thing. I think a couple of the improvements that many of us are hoping to see around the world as these codes get adopted is more transparency. So we know who's getting the money, what are they doing with it. Canada is actually requiring that the terms of the deal be given to the regulator. In Australia, there's no such condition, so Rod Sims is the only person in the whole country who actually knows who's getting what. So I think transparency is important, and then, as mentioned earlier, mechanisms to make sure that both large and small outlets get money. So I think those are two things that globally we're really hoping to see. I was told by Laura that I should transition over to Jose. And of course, the initiative in New York has nothing to do with the bargaining codes, but everything to do with helping smaller outlets. So I'd love to hear what New York has been doing.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. So my name is Jose Bayona. I'm the Executive Director for the New York City Mayor's Office of Ethnic and Community Media. This is an office that was created last year when Eric Adams became the mayor. Before, when Bill de Blasio was the mayor, we have an executive order in place. I was part of the administration, the prior administration, and that executive order mandated 50% of every city agency budget, advertising budget, marketing budget to be spent on print and digital, ethnic and community media, on print and digital. So that executive order started in 2019 until the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, and that was a lifesaver for more than 300 outlets in the city. During the pandemic, as you know, the print stopped, but all the digital operation continue, and only about 5% of more than 300 outlets went out of business, and the other 95% they stay in business. That was a huge success during the pandemic, when around the country and around the world, many outlets in media outlets went out of their business because of the pandemic. So during the transition, that when we were campaigning, we created the Local Law 83. So this is the first office in the United States, and I'm not sure if in the world, that creates mandates and creates a goal for government to spend 50% on any community media, but this time we expanded to TV and radio, digital, print, TV, and radio. So, and that covers all the small outlets in New York City. Is this a viable solution? For New York City it is. So for more than 300 outlets that are here in more than 50 languages and covering more than 25 communities, it is a solution because now they can stay in business. How it is a solution? It is because we need to set the rules clearly in the law. That's the key. So knowing exactly who is playing what part on the law and how we implementing that.
So I have two questions for you. Number one, how much corruption was there? Did people lie about their circulation? Did new outlets suddenly appear overnight? And number two, let's say CNN en Español or Univision Español has like a lot more audience than a printed, I don't know, El Diario or whatever. How did you balance the need to actually communicate effectively with the desire to support local outlets?
Yes, the first one about the corruption, yeah, it was everywhere. I can tell you that. But not only on the way that the outlets sometimes lie about the circulation, about that. That ended last year when my office updated the directory. We have a citywide marketing directory, and 220 outlets were admitted into that. But they have to present all the documents, how many copies they print per weekly. And we install some trackers to the media vendors, trackers on their website, so we knew exactly how many visitors they have. And for TV and radio, we look for ways in the community because they are not federal, they don't have the federal license, so we look for ways in the community to know that. So, but it's also, the corruption was also on the media advertising companies, because the city government doesn't place advertising directly on the outlets. We use advertising companies, and those advertising companies, depending on the leadership on the advertising and the level of diversity, it was very low, so they were sending most of the money to the mainstream media. So as you say, CNN en Español or NBC or the big outlets, they got more. So but when we brought more like media advertising companies, they were more diverse. They were from our communities, they were Black, Latinos, Asian. So they saw, they were connected to these outlets, and they said, now we need to divert the investment on this side. So it's different in all the levels. But I've been listening to all the comments here about government versus media, and that I think it's 50-50 too, because many small media outlets play sometimes some games that we need to go through and check on them and say, no, you are telling us that you have all this audience, you are telling us that you print all this, and you're telling us that you have all this staff, and at the end of the day, it's only one person in the living room doing this and getting all the money, while there are others, companies that are trying to survive, and you need to know them. You need to be part of the community to go through them.
We're listening to a discussion on regulation that has an impact on media viability, but we all know that in most countries, regulation is very often used for repression. Joel Simon has just released a report with the Dow Center on weaponization of the law in order to suppress media freedom. So yeah, we might actually regulate a little bit to improve some revenues, but at the same time not if actually it would lead to more censorship, to more actions against journalists. How to balance this act in countries where governments, parliaments have a very negative track record in terms of supporting media?
Hi, I can provide some
perspective or experiences on that side of things. So, Niamh Hanfin, I work for the UN Development Programme, but prior to that have spent my entire career in media development in different parts of the world. So, and implementing kind of on the cold face of this. And I've seen, you know, I started doing this in 1998. And I sit here today and I wonder if this conversation has changed much since then, quite honestly. Because when you're on the implementation side of this, and I'm going to come to the regulation question, I promise, but when you're on the implementation side of this, the fights that we were fighting in 1998 are the same fights that we're fighting today, which is we cannot get donors to invest in real risk-taking, and we cannot get donors to invest in human beings. And this, for me, has been a critical challenge in every program I've implemented over these years. And so when we talk about radical changes, I'm not sure that the changes need to be that radical, but I completely agree with Tom's point that they do need to be collective messages from this community to those who are designing these policies.
What do you mean by investing in human beings? What do you mean by investing in human beings?
So very simply, what I mean is I've established, along with teams, a number of community radio stations in different parts of Africa and Asia. And donors will happily finance the transmitter, the building, the paint, the studio installation, the recording equipment. They will not cover the salaries of the journalists and the managers who work in those buildings. And a lot of those people are farmers in their spare time. When you're looking at these very remote rural communities, they don't have livelihoods in the same way. And it leads to constant and very uncomfortable conversations between myself, my team, and a group of volunteers in a beautifully equipped radio station that don't understand why there's nothing in it for them, who are putting their lives on the line in some cases, in South Kivu, in DRC, in Central African Republic, in Angola, who are taking significant risks. So that's what I mean. On the regulation question, so one of the models I saw working really well, and it was an interesting one, it was in Central African Republic. I used to work for an organization called Search for Common Ground, which is a peace-building organization that does significant work with media, television and radio. And at the time, there was a significant spike in a very polarized media environment, a spike in hate speech, a very fragile environment as well, and a very top-down and very heavy-handed regulator. So we were having a lot of problematic content being broadcast online, a lot of problematic content coming through the media, the traditional media. So, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say the word, and I hate it too, multi-stakeholder, I hate that word, we got to come up with a better one. Collective action, I know, gosh. Anyway, but we were able to bring together a group of people to work around that regulator. There was civil society, there was lawyers, there was media editors, it really was a pretty diverse group, and they had to review cases collectively and come up with their collective ruling on what the course of action was for infractions of the media law. And it worked really well, but it comes back to my point, right? So we didn't buy any desks, chairs, computers, whatever. We just needed people in the room. And when you can't finance people's time and reward them for what they're doing and the contribution that they're making, and I don't mean this like per diem culture, right, which is in itself kind of toxic, but a really genuine investment in people's capacity. And people-centered approaches to all of this. Media is so completely people-centered, with very little technology you can do amazing things. But you need to have those people with that incredible courage and drive and everything else to actually go out and make it happen. So I want to tie these two things together and just say that, yes, we can talk about regulation and ways to make that better, and it involves a huge investment from many different parts of society. And we have to link it back to the question of a totally dysfunctioning financial model for this type of work.
I was a little bit surprised when you said you hate the word collective and multi-stakeholder approach. I guess it's because so
yeah,
like so many words, they then become suddenly like, I don't know, like empty phrases that are used, and yeah, we do this multi-stakeholder. But I think you can always come back to what Zoe said, and what makes absolute sense to me. If the system is so broken, and if there are no viable business models, at least not yet, about how to finance independent quality media, then we definitely have to find a way to improve the sense among people that this is important. And I think this is often lacking. And for that, we have to bring together civil society organizations of all different kinds. I mean, right now, at GFMD, of course, the organizations are, trying to come together, but it's not really working that much in many ways. I mean, I remember, Jesper here, a few years ago, we were coming together in Ethiopia and, trying to have this approach, we tell each other what we do, we try to not do the same things, we try to make things work together. But in many ways, it stayed at that level of having good intentions. And I really think we really, especially, and not just the international organization, but also the local organizations, societies, have to bring them together. I think there's a role for the UN there, because it's, even in countries that are ruled by not very democratically minded people, the UN is still an organization that is respected, gives them prestige. So there has to be, I believe, from all what I heard today, there has to be this approach that we have to focus more on the value of journalism, of receiving this kind of information. And by that, building, whatever it is. I mean, in some countries it might be a public service broadcaster model. In others it might be a model where advertisement is distributed. There might be other models. But the first step is, I think, creating this kind of consciousness about the value of independent information.
Yeah, I actually wanted to pick up on that, and it was something I was thinking about. It is a really big elephant in the room. If you poll in most countries, the credibility of the media is at the bottom. So we were talking about the audiences will decide, like I think they said, which is true. But the audiences are not believing the media. Of course, it's a concern or effort of governments as well. I totally agree with you. I mean, big part of it is seeing the value, what people see. And sometimes we tend to be around our rooms and around the development rooms, right? But I've also worked in community media, and I've also gone in the grounds. And even, going into Ukraine now, the media in the regions, not the national media. The ones reporting from Bakhmut, but the ones reporting from Kherson or Zaporizhia or etc., right? I wanted to link it back to the Stratcom, because I have worked on Stratcom. The question is, what do you communicate? And a big part, I think, that we need to try to get donors to work on the Stratcom is to change the shift of the offensive. How do we explain to the average citizen why it's important to keep the media? Because we are, if you look at football or soccer, you started the game losing 0-5 or 5-0. It's not an even game. How do we turn it around and say, why is it important? Why is it important for a company that has a government contract that doesn't want to touch it to understand it's free media? Because when they come after you, who's going to this event? So I think a big part of it, and it's a big part of talking to the donors as well, while the economic model is broken, etc., it is also true, on the other hand, that it's a lot cheaper to produce content right now in many places. The question is how we do it. But a big part of it is, at the end of the day, we talk about the supply, but the demand. I teach students, and I don't only teach it in Florida International University, I get invited to a university to go for a semester and so on. And they got free access, right? Free access, but they don't read it. And if we don't have the supply, this is something we need to focus on and really be on the offensive from the communication side, to really help save the media in the long run as well.
I'm Dagmar Thiel with Fundamedios, an organization of freedom of expression in Ecuador, and talking about funding, I think it's very important to talk about how the funds get to the lower income countries. We've got huge donors who give the money to huge organizations, and those huge organizations, they go down to other grantees, and the other grantees, they go down to local funders, and the local funders finally give a training course and some equipment to the journalists. So how can we do that? How can we change this system so the money goes directly to the local organizations where they can pay for the work of journalists, and they can do more with that money instead of paying overhead 50%, 30%, 60% for international organizations. So I think that's also very important to think, where does the money stay?
Thank you very much. We're running out of time. Caroline, do you want to make the last intervention?
Because we were on regulation, I wanted to point out that initiative, the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is media outlet self-assessing themselves in terms of governance, transparency on funding, ethical regulations. And I think it's a good marker for trust within the media, vis-à-vis the audience, vis-à-vis the advertisers, the potential partners. So regulation doesn't have only to be from outside and institutions, but it can also be done by the media through the Journalism Trust Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a lot we heard about. We had a bit over 90 minutes and 23 people contributed. That I think is great. Thank you for that. Thank you for taking on this experiment. But Ayman, you have the last word. What is your overall? It's a very easy question, right? What do you take away now? What is the radical approach?
What was very interesting is the word that Caroline mentioned, but earlier as well. If we want to think about a regulation that is successful, if the word transparency is extremely important. Anya Schifrin also asked the question, can you provide the details, can you provide the numbers, who's doing what, etc. Maybe this is a key. Regardless when, where, in which country, if it's transparent, it might work. If it's not transparent, we know that it might have destructive results. So overall takeaway, keywords, local, hyperlocal, context specific, transparency, and boldness. If we're not talking about radical change and completely revolutionizing the system, but at least being bold, and whatever our friend from Ecuador, I think, mentioned, and the others, having this bold conversation with the donors, with the different players. Google understood it, Meta understood it. They all have policy teams, which in fact are lobbyists. And they hire them from the best universities because they understand that they need to have a conversation with these policymakers. It's not something we can afford financially, but at the same time, it's something we can understand conceptually, and we're all smart enough to engage in these policy discussions. And this is what the big platforms understood. They are at play in Indonesia, they are at play in Canada, everywhere in Brazil. We can be at play also at that level, listening to the hyperlocals, be context specific and transparent. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone. There's a little bit of drinks and some snacks there. We have lots of points that we should further discuss. But as I said, an experiment has to start and to finish. So please raise your hands again and we clap on 3. 1, 2. Thank you.